You're listening to Summit Church, where faith comes alive and Jesus is at the center. For more information, go to our website at wearesummit.ca or find us on socials. Thanks for connecting, and stay watching for this week's message.
So, in keeping with our series that we're now starting about encounters with Jesus, I wanted to think about something that was, I guess, kind of connected a little bit to Mother's Day. And I think the subject that perhaps connects us to this passage we're going to look at is about the idea that I think many mothers, and I think this is not exclusive to mothers, but I'm sure it's true of mothers, that kind of something about human love feeling another person's pain. There's something about people feeling the pain of someone that they're nurturing and caring for that I think is especially something to bring into focus on a day where we celebrate mothers. So the passage we're going to look at is really about that. It's about the fact that there's women highlighted in this passage that have felt pain or felt suffering in some way, and in fact over a kind of quite a long period of time. And so Jesus comes into this moment and encounters both of these kind of groups of people or individuals and restores and brings hope where people have run out of answers. So I want to remind you before we get to the passage that I'm not going to take as long this time as I did last week, but we're looking at these passages through a certain framework. Whenever we see Jesus encountering somebody in the Gospels, then there's kind of almost like a way to kind of view that encounter so that we get out of it something for us and for those around us. And the first thing is that the framework is about looking at first about Jesus' character. When he encounters somebody, what character does he display? What is it about how he encounters this person, talks to this person, acts with this person? As we observe the character of Jesus, Jesus himself said, "As you've seen me, you've seen the Father." He is the perfect representation of his being. And so when we see Jesus in a particular way, what we're learning about is not just Jesus, we're learning about the character of God himself. And I hope that's something that you want to know about. Like I do. I want to be impacted by who God is and learn more about him, because I think I probably haven't yet exhausted all the possible kind of things about the Lord that I know. I think there's probably more to know. The second kind of lens or kind of thing is about how people responded to Jesus, because as we notice how people respond to Jesus, like their reactions reveal all sorts of things that we possibly could be emulating in our life as we respond to Jesus. Faith, humility, fear, resistance, hunger, transformation, things we want to stay away from, things we want to welcome, if that makes sense. So the first thing is about understanding who Jesus is in this moment. Second thing about how people respond to him. And the third thing is that there's a strong message in the New Testament about us as the church, is that we're called to be ambassadors of Jesus, to represent him or represent him to the world. And so I think it's really helpful for us as a church to be clear about what it is that we're representing or what we're presenting. I don't need to go very far for you possibly to think of the fact that many people who say they're Christians or belong to Jesus sometimes don't represent him well. Okay, we'll just leave that there. And so I think it's clear for us to hear from the Lord how he wants us to represent him. And I think we see that in the way that Jesus interacts with people, right? So with all that in mind, are you good? Good. We're going to look at Mark chapter 5. We're going to start at verse 21. We're going to read a whole section of scripture. This is probably, I usually don't read massive, long things of scripture, but that's okay. I think it's a good thing to do every now and then. This is a big story. So settle in for story time. Get yourself warm and comfortable. Maybe a nice cup of something. Take a deep breath. Mark 5:21. What you're going to notice in a minute is that this is actually two stories in one. There's actually a story sandwiched by another story, but both of them have a very similar theme, and we'll explore that in a second. So when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had. It was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house, some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The first thing to note about this passage is that this is part of a progression that Mark is showing in his writing. That this is not accidental. In fact, as you look back over the previous few chapters, there's something that Mark is trying to show his readers about the authority and the power of Jesus. In Mark chapter 4, there's a story of Jesus calming the sea, calming the storm. And in that, Mark is showing the authority that Jesus has over nature, over the natural world. And then in the next kind of passage, or the one just before this, Jesus heals the demon-possessed man, again showing Jesus' power and authority over the spiritual realm, over the demonic realm. So there's here, Mark is showing Jesus has got all power and authority over everything in nature, and also in the spiritual dimension and demons as well. And then we come to this passage where it's a progression through that Jesus also has authority over sickness and over death and over anything that can basically harm a person. Jesus has authority over that as well. So there's no accident here in this story that Mark is making a point about Jesus' authority and his power. So how can we view this passage through the framework we mentioned earlier? The first thing we need to notice is, what does this passage tell us about Jesus' character? And so what it reveals about who God is. The first thing that I want to point out, and there's lots of things in this passage, but the first thing that I'll point out is that Jesus never treats people as interruptions. I want to put that as a thing to notice first of all about Jesus and his character. He never treats people as interruptions. You know, he allows himself to be interrupted. In fact, both of the characters in this passage interrupt Jesus. Jairus is the first person because Jesus is actually preparing, or by the side of the sea in the boat, ready to teach the crowd of people that are gathered there. But then Jairus comes with a need. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't say, "Hey, I've got a plan here. I'm supposed to be doing this. Can you wait till later?" He responds immediately to that need. It's not an interruption to him. It's something that's just, he's going to respond to the person who's coming before him. Obviously, the second thing is that on his way to Jairus' house, the woman interrupts the moment of him traveling there by touching his garment and basically being healed, and that was an interruption, which led to the fact that it seemed that Jesus was too late to heal Jairus' daughter. But we know the end of the story, which is great. Jesus is fully present with people in front of him. Like, he's compassionate and not hurried. There's no sense of him being frantic, even when we are, or when the characters in this story are desperate and frantic and they have a need. There's not a sense that his delay is never carelessness. Does that make sense? Like, the delay that he engages in is not careless in terms of the other needs or the other things he needs to do. There's an ability that he has to navigate all these different ways of encountering people or being interrupted, but still maintaining his mission and his timing and being present to people and being compassionate and caring for people. Do you ever feel like the Lord, maybe this is just a self-confession moment, but like sometimes have this idea that like God's got more important things to do than see to the things that I've got going on? You know, I've spent time with and I've met people who have been in other countries where being a Christian is illegal. Like, we have a really good friend, whenever we go to California, we meet a wonderful family who've come from Uzbekistan, and there's all sorts of stories they had of kind of the government seizing their possessions and all sorts of things. And we've met people from China who've been in part of the underground church in China. And whenever I meditate on all that, I'm like, compared to the things they've gone through, the fact that the government could be beating down their door any moment, they've got to worship in secret and all this sort of stuff, I'm like, what have I got to complain about? It's like, I sometimes have this thought that I don't think is a God thought, but it's almost like, hey God, like there's people out there who are encountering that right now. Why don't you, I think it's probably better that you go and sort them out than the fact that I'm having a bad day because my computer's not working right or something. But the truth of it is that what's the root of that is that we're actually really believing that God has limited resources. That actually, like, he's only got so much healing power, and so he needs to divert some of that to the other person rather than us. But that's not true. Actually, Jesus wants to be present to every need. And we see that in this story, that he's on mission to go and heal Jairus' daughter, but this person comes in an unexpected moment, and he's just as present to that person than the other person. And so for us, I just feel like that's something of the character of God to be aware of, is that Jesus is showing that no matter what you're going through, no matter how big or how small or how significant you think it is or insignificant you think it is, he cares, he has compassion for it, and he's present to you in the moment, no matter what it is. A leader that I like to follow says, there's no win in comparison. Sometimes we're tempted to compare our life with someone else's, and it never leads, I don't think, to anything good. Whether you think someone's doing better than you or worse than you, it doesn't matter. God's present to where you are at right now and knows you intimately and values you and is present to you. That's his character, and we see that in Jesus in this moment. The other thing we're going to notice about Jesus in terms of his character right now is that it's important to note that this whole passage is about Jesus' authority to heal and to restore. Like in both of these stories, in both healings, do you see that Jesus acts with almost like a quiet confidence? There's no drama about what he goes and does. There's no panic, struggle, or ritual. Or in the way that he heals people, he's not kind of like leaping around and kind of like throwing dust in the air or kind of like, all this sort of stuff, or using kind of magic hands or kind of things like that. There's nothing of that, is there? There's no kind of like, there's just a sense of peace and quiet and confidence that he has to minister in these situations. I love the moment that he speaks to the daughter who's died and just simply says that the interesting thing about this story is that Aramaic phrase is preserved here, which is kind of actually means, it's like an affectionate phrase, Talitha Kumi, which kind of just means, Like when you'd wake up a child, if you want to be gentle about it, gosh, I could tell you stories. There were times when my mother got frustrated with us boys that we wouldn't get out of bed. One time, I should share this, actually. Anyway, somebody got a bucket of water thrown over them because they wouldn't get out of bed. Anyway, we've all had therapy, it's all fine. It's good. But in this moment, if you were to wake up a child and be gentle about that, then actually this is the phrase you would use in Aramaic. You just, hey, it's time to get up. There's no craziness, right? Jesus is just quietly confident in terms of the way he ministers in his authority and his power. But there's something extra in this as well, because especially in the woman with the issue of blood, and whatever you want to call that, that's sometimes the unhelpful phrase in some of your Bibles says the woman with the issue of blood. That doesn't mean issue meaning problem, issue meaning flow. Does that make sense? I don't want to go into the biology of all this, but if that's happening to you, for women who would go through that every month, while that was happening, they would be ritually unclean according to the law. So they would have to separate themselves until that time had passed and they could begin cleansed and come back into temple worship. So you can imagine for 12 years, this woman has been bleeding. Horrendous. But not just horrendous physically, because obviously there's incredible health problems that would come from that, but also from a societal perspective, because she's ritually unclean for the entire time that she's bleeding. And so she's rejected, outcast. She can't be in the temple. She can't be in worship. She can't be in fellowship with people. She's basically on herself. And for some reason, there's a mention here that she's also suffered greatly because of many physicians who've tried to help her. And I can't even imagine what they've tried to do to help her with that problem. So there's something here that's an extra layer than just the physical need that she has. And there's a very small moment here, but it's incredibly significant. And Jesus, instead of just kind of recognizing that she's been healed, he calls her daughter. He calls her daughter. In that moment, I believe what Jesus is doing is not just healing her, but also restoring her. Also giving her back her identity and her status and who she really is. And calling that out of her. For 12 years, she's not been anybody. She's been an outcast. In this moment, Jesus heals her and restores who she is. So God is in the business of healing, but also restoring. I think that's a good thing for us to be in mind of about his character, is that we encounter people around us that it's not always just about the surface needs that people have. There's also deeper needs that Jesus wants to touch and heal and restore as well. That's two things about God, but also the next thing about how do we see people in this passage responding to Jesus? Well, the only thing I want to just point to you is that desperation can become the doorway to faith. Desperation can become the doorway to faith. Both of these people in this passage, both Jairus and the woman, model different expressions of faith, but both have come to the point where they are desperate because all the other options have failed. Nothing else has worked. They're at the end of their resources and they're desperate for something to happen. And they come to Jesus. Something about that desperate moment when you've got nothing left, when you've got no other option, when all of your ideas and practices and things that people have told you to do, when all of that has come to an end and you realize that actually there's nothing you can do, there's perhaps something about that moment that for these people led to a desperation for the Lord to move, for Jesus to heal, for Jesus to be in a part of what's going on. I think that there's a drive that comes from that to engage with the Lord. I don't want to say this lightly, But I think for me, what I've kind of meditated over is like, how desperate am I at times for the Lord to move in my life? If I'm really honest, I think that at times I'm not as desperate as I think perhaps I could be. In fact, I don't know whether desperate is a word that I've used very often. But there's something about desperation, of kind of needing Jesus because you're aware that nothing else works. I think sometimes in life we try everything else before we try Jesus. I don't know whether that's the right way around, really. I think it might be better to shortcut that process and try Jesus first, rather than going through a lot of pain and suffering before we run out of options. You know, there's something about that faith that Jairus and the woman had in this moment that Jesus responded to. In fact, Jesus even said to the woman that your faith has made you well. Faith isn't just agreeing mentally with truths about Jesus. I want to say to you in this passage, what we see is that faith actually moves people towards Jesus. That in this moment, Jairus is the one who approaches Jesus. That his faith was not just kind of, well, if God's going to heal, God's going to heal. And I'll stay at home and wait until to see if that happens or not. Like, this desperation and this faith actually moved Jairus to encounter Jesus, to fall at his feet on his knees and basically beg for Jesus to come to his house because he believed that Jesus could heal his daughter. Really, Jairus is risking public embarrassment. He's the leader of the synagogue. He's the pastor, basically. He's the one who should have all the answers. Should have his life all figured out and lined up. Of course, that's most pastors. But really, in this moment, Jairus is risking that kind of like, almost like publicly kind of recognizing that he is desperate and needing of something else. For the woman, obviously, the desperation means that she's pushing through the crowd that probably are the group of people that have kind of rejected her and kind of also kind of like that she's outside of that circle, and so she's risking kind of public humiliation or rejection to reach through to Jesus. So I want to leave you with this question: what we prepared to do in engaging Jesus for what we need? Are we desperate for him to move, or at least understand that he is the best option? That's what I think we can see from the response of these people in this passage. The question is, like, they were prepared to do everything in this moment to have Jesus. What about the last thing? The three things that we're looking at as a lens is like, we're looking at Jesus and how he interacts with people, and that shows us as God's character. We see the people in the passage responding to him, and that informs us of kind of perhaps how we could be inspired to respond to him. And then the last one is about representing him, about how we can represent Jesus in the way that he is with people to others around us. The first thing I want to point out of this passage is that Jesus notices the overlooked. Jesus notices the overlooked. In this passage, the woman that he heals is basically the rejected of society. Not a good person to hang around with. Not someone you should be having over your house. But he notices the overlooked. He notices the ones who are outcast. It was inconvenient. She was unclean. But he publicly affirms her, doesn't shame her. He restores her socially and spiritually. As followers of Jesus, we're called to see people beyond labels, beyond their personal history, and beyond their social value, to see people as God does. That's what we're called to do with people around us. And I think, to a certain degree, some of us may find that hard or uncomfortable. Like, at times in my life, there's been moments when I've had to kind of be amongst people that are very different to me, that I've actually at times, whether you realise this or not, from an English perspective, I have quite a posh accent. You may not know that. Zoe teases me about it the whole time, which is great. And so in England, when you're with different sets of people, there is a sense of judging people by how they speak and how they turn up. And one of my jobs I used to do was I used to go into this area of Birmingham, this city, called Chelmsley Wood, which sounds very posh and nice, but it's the back end of nowhere. It's the worst place in the city that you could go to. It's rife with crime and drugs and everything you can think of, basically. And everyone's grown up their whole life in the hood. And yes, England does have lots of places that are like that. And so I would go into these places trying to engage young people, 15 and 16-year-olds, basically, but immediately because of my accent and the way I spoke, I'd be known as someone who's an outsider. And someone who probably they thought I was better than them. But my challenge in that moment was kind of be a bit like this, that there were young men who basically been overlooked by other people, or not valued, or thought they wouldn't amount to much. And because of that, they were out of school, not attending school, basically getting into trouble. I remember one kid I met with who had 7 other agencies working with him at the same time as me. He had a support worker, he had a drug worker, he had a counsellor, he had a psychiatrist, he had all those people trying to help him. And he came from generations of men in his family that never had a job, were addicted to drugs or alcohol and crime and all that sort of stuff. And here we were trying to break the cycle. And it was easy probably for us just to think, oh, he's just going to follow everyone else. But in this moment, this is what the value, I think, representing Jesus is to be as present as you can to people who are overlooked, people who society doesn't value or think that they're outcast or not worth what they need to be worth in the eyes of the Lord. You know, I think kingdom ministry often begins by noticing the people that society ignores. It's not just helping people function better. It's helping people rediscover their identity in who God has made them to be. That's a core value of Christian thinking, is that every person has been made in the image of God. And they have value, no matter what. This is what we see in Jesus in this moment. The other thing that I think is good, you guys doing okay? It's super challenging, I think, for us to engage with that idea. But I think it's something that the Holy Spirit can help us with. The other thing that I think is good for us to be aware of is that Jesus, something we can adopt or represent Jesus in a way, is that he made time for interruptions. He was okay with interruptions. I don't know about you, but Jesus allowed ministry to happen on the way. Like he was on the way to Jairus' house, and in the middle of that, he was interrupted. And often, I don't know about you, but when I'm on the way somewhere, I'm very focused about where I'm going, and not always kind of very kind of open to a change of plan. In fact, yeah, Zoe makes fun of me again. There was this movie that we saw that kind of like the lead character says, like, think of a plan, make a plan, and always deliver. And that's kind of like my stick to the plan, make a plan, stick to the plan, always deliver. And that's kind of my little catchphrase of life. And so it's a challenge for me in the middle of making a plan and sticking to the plan to be someone who's okay with being interrupted in the middle of the plan. But this is what Jesus is like. Jesus is okay with being sensitive and actually being present to people in the midst of whatever he's about, whatever he's doing. Like a long time ago, not that long ago actually, but like maybe about 9 months ago, I was kind of, sometimes I'll try and find somewhere different to kind of like do either sermon prep or kind of like journaling or Bible study and stuff like that. And I was on a great little, on the rails to trails, there's a little gazebo place that I was there with my stuff, and I'd ridden my bike there, and I was having a great time with the Lord, kind of like, and then somebody running past decided to pull up his bike and then sit down opposite me. And I was like, And I'm like, thank you, Jesus. The challenge of that moment is that like I was all focused and having a great time, kind of preparing my stuff and thinking and writing. And then somebody was like, and I knew it wasn't that hard. I'm perhaps dramatizing it more than I should, but then there's someone who wants to talk to me, a stranger, someone I've never met. And so it's kind of like this is time to be interrupted and be okay with being interrupted. If I don't get my sermon finished, we'll figure something out another time. And it's like we had a great conversation, and like it was kind of interesting, and he was curious about who I was, what I was doing, why I was there. And if you want a little tip about encountering people who are curious about faith in Jesus, if you sit down somewhere and open your Bible and start to look at it, sooner or later someone will turn up. It's happened to me lots of times. I was in a shopping mall in the UK once, like after work, and I was reading my Bible. And like you can imagine, like a food court kind of place, and like from across the way, this woman got up and came straight towards me and said, "I see you're reading the Bible. Like, tell me more about why you're reading that." And I've never seen a young person as when I was young. It's good to think of those times. Yeah, she said, "I've never seen a young person reading their Bible." And so again, we had a conversation about that. Jesus made time for interruptions. Perhaps this week we need to pray that we would be interrupted and be open and ready to be present to people in the moment. I think that's all that Jesus expects of us. I think that's one of the things that I think would be good to just clarify for a moment. I don't know what you think about that, if someone ever interrupts you and asks you about faith, whether you think, oh, this is it now. Like, I mean, I've got my apologetics course, I've got to have all the objections and the way to explain the gospel and I've got to know all the stuff basically, and I've got to be able to explain this and kind of argue this person and I'm going to win them for Jesus, like all this sort of stuff. But I think that Jesus models something for us in this passage that actually what we're called to do is really mainly just be present. Just be present for people. Be authentically who you are. Because that's who Jesus was in this moment. Like he was just present to people. And I think actually that's enough of a challenge for a lot of us. I don't know about you, but my mind is often going also, I've got a list of things in my head that I'm trying to think, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to be there. And then I've got devices chirping at me, telling me I've got another message from someone or an email. And it's actually, I think, enough of a challenge for us to be present for people in the moment we encounter them, rather than just distracted by kind of this, that, and the other, and whatever's going on. Squirrel. Where can we end this? It is going to end. Faith keeps moving us towards Jesus. That's what I think is good to recognize out of this. Faith keeps moving us towards Jesus. That's what faith looks like, moving us towards Jesus. Jairus came publicly, the woman came secretly, but one was respected, one was overlooked, one was named, one was anonymous in this passage, but both moved towards Jesus, and neither of them left unchanged by that encounter. So maybe that's the invitation of this passage, to keep moving towards Jesus, no matter where we're at. Maybe we're afraid, like Jairus was. Maybe we're disappointed, even when our answers seem delayed, even when we feel ashamed or that we don't qualify, even when circumstances have worsened. This story reminds us that Jesus is not distant from anyone who's desperate for him to move in their life. So I want to encourage us this morning out of this passage. I think it's an encouragement to bring our real need honestly to Jesus. That we don't have to hide the areas where we need healing. Keep trusting him, even when there's a delay. Slow down enough to notice those people around us that have been overlooked. And become interruptible, like Jesus was. Worship team.